Have you ever wondered how an unknown soldier of the Ottoman Empire could become the father of a new nation? A rebel within the crumbling empire, a cold strategist on the battlefield, and a bold reformer in peacetime. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was not only the founder of the Turkish Republic, but also the one who completely transformed the national identity. From the trenches of Gallipoli to the stormy parliament halls in Ankara, his journey was a symphony of ideals, practicality, and an unwavering will. But were these sweeping reforms, from the alphabet, the legal system, to religion, a path to modernity, or a controversial break from the past? Let's explore the life of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. From his childhood in Salonika to his final days in Istanbul, to understand why he remains one of the most defining figures of the 20th century, and why the name Atatürk continues to spark debate, reverence, and admiration, even today. The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes, or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article. The days in Salonika, the first glimpse toward the west. Before the name Mustafa Kemal echoed through the Turkish political scene, he was just a young boy in a small neighborhood of Salonika, a port city on the Aegean coast where the Mediterranean winds swept through cobblestone streets and oil lamps flickered in the night. Salonika, at that time, was unlike many other cities in the Ottoman Empire. It was a place where three religions coexisted, where Greeks, Jews, Turks, and Armenians shared streets and marketplaces. And in this very city, a young Ottoman boy first saw a world that existed not only in the Quran and the teachings of his religious teachers. The house where Mustafa Kemal grew up was not wealthy, but it was strict and disciplined. His mother, Zubaydah, was a devout woman who hoped her son would follow the traditional Islamic path. But Mustafa had questions he couldn't quite name. He wondered about the newspapers printed in Latin script sold at the market corner, about the people wearing Western clothes walking the streets, and why their language resonated so loudly in conversations at the local cafe. When he decided to apply to the military high school, his mother opposed it. But the stubbornness, a trait that would later become legendary, had already begun. At the school, where military discipline was paramount, Mustafa learned not only to march, but also mathematics, physics, and history, subjects that opened up a horizon far beyond the dull religious texts of his childhood. Salonika, a city of diverse ideologies, became the first bridge that led Mustafa's gaze westward. On late nights, when his classmates were asleep, it's said that he would stay up reading about Napoleon, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the world maps showing how the Ottoman Empire, his homeland, was shrinking. Perhaps it was here, amid the multicultural streets and the echoes of many languages, that Mustafa Kemal began to question, why is his empire crumbling? Why must the Turks remain under the shadow of old powers while other nations rise with steamships, printing presses, and Western schools? Salonika didn't just teach him knowledge. It ignited a small but enduring flame in his heart, a flame about change, about a different Turkey, stronger, more independent, and no longer the late learner of the West. But this flame didn't yet have a clear shape. It was just the distant gaze of a teenager sitting silently at the window of his classroom, imagining things that even he couldn't yet name. 1908, when gunfire signals hope. In 1908, the Ottoman Empire was shaken by a bloodless yet profound coup, the Young Turk Revolution. It was a moment when those forgotten at the empire's fringes, like the young officer Mustafa Kemal, who longed for reform, first felt the true power of their ideals. The Young Turk movement was not a unified party. It was a tangled network of intellectuals, students, journalists, and officers who all believed the 1876 Constitution must be restored and that an autocratic monarchy could no longer lead the empire into the new era. They did not agree on everything, but they were united by one idea: silence had lasted too long. At the time, Mustafa Kemal was just in his 20s and did not play a leading role in the revolution. Instead, he closely observed every shift, every movement behind the scenes of power. He was not the one rallying in the square, but a keen observer, calm and silently preparing for the day he would step onto the stage. When the constitution was restored, Sultan Abdul Hamid II was forced to yield to the rising wave of anger. Those exiled to the border provinces were called back to Istanbul. Banned newspapers were allowed to republish, and young officers like Mustafa Kemal began to find their place in the military and the changing political landscape. However, the joy was short-lived. Just a year later, in 1909, a counter-revolution erupted. Forces loyal to the Sultan and the clergy revolted, demanding the abolition of the constitution. Istanbul descended into chaos. Mustafa Kemal did not wait for orders. Under the banner of the Action Army, a force loyal to the revolution, he led thousands of soldiers from Salonika to the capital, quelling the rebellion within days. It was in this campaign that he proved himself not only a thinker, but a resolute, disciplined, and effective military leader. That victory did not just protect the constitution. It also marked the first time Mustafa Kemal's name was recognized at the center of power. A young officer, once raised in a small neighborhood in Salonika and exiled in the desert, had now entered the ranks of those with influence, still unofficial, but full of potential. When Istanbul returned to peace, the Ottoman Empire remained like a flickering oil lamp in the wind, flickering, uncertain. But in that faint light, the silhouette of a man began to emerge more clearly. Someone who was quietly preparing for the moment when he would rewrite history with his own hands. Gallipoli, the birth of a legend. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire, though aging and weakened, was dragged into the maelstrom of history. Aligning with the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, they faced off against the Allies, including Britain, France, and Russia, a decision that would determine the fate of millions. And at the Gallipoli Peninsula, a narrow strip of land by the Dardanelles, the destiny of Mustafa Kemal would be forever altered. At that time, he was a lieutenant colonel, commanding the 19th Division stationed near Anafarta. On April 25, 1915, when the Allied Expeditionary Forces, particularly the Anzac, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, landed on the shores of Gallipoli, the campaign officially began. One of the largest amphibious assaults in modern history, aimed at breaking through the Ottoman defenses and opening the way to Istanbul. The Allies' plan was bold, but it lacked knowledge of the terrain and underestimated the fighting spirit of the Ottoman troops. It was during the chaos of the initial assault that Mustafa Kemal performed the unexpected. Not waiting for orders from above, he made an immediate decision to send his troops to the hot spot where the Anzac forces were advancing. His command to his officers became immortalized. "I do not order you to win. I order you to die." This was not madness, but a cold, calculated strategy. To hold the enemy at all costs until the main forces could arrive. And the impossible happened. The Allied attacks were halted. The front lines froze. The hills, sandy beaches, and ravines of Gallipoli turned into a hell on earth for nearly a year. In every battle, in every loss, the name Mustafa Kemal was mentioned more and more. He didn't fight from behind. He was at the front lines, with his soldiers, enduring the bombardment, thirst, hunger, and casualties. In the hearts of the Ottoman soldiers, he became more than a commander. He was a guide in the darkness. The Gallipoli campaign ultimately failed. The Allied forces withdrew in silence, carrying with them tens of thousands of corpses and an indelible stain in the memory of war. For the Turkish people, It marked the first victory after many years of defeat and the birth of a hero. Mustafa Kemal didn't just defeat the enemy, he won the hearts of an entire nation. For the first time, the exhausted and skeptical Ottoman people felt they could place their trust not in a fading sultan or distant gods, but in the man who stood amidst the bullets, choosing to die rather than retreat. And from the blood-soaked trenches of Gallipoli, a legend began to rise, the legend of Atatürk. From the ashes of war to Ankara, the seed for a new nation. World War I ended in 1918 with the Ottoman Empire in ruin. The Central Powers had been defeated. The Allied forces entered Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and a harsh treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, was imposed on the Turks. The empire was divided. The Greeks occupied Smyrna, Izmir. The Armenians were promised a state, and the Kurds were on the brink of autonomy. The West occupied, the East dissolved, the center of power weakened. And in the midst of it all, the people of Turkey were confused, angry, and betrayed. In this darkest moment, Mustafa Kemal once again stepped out of the shadows. But this time, he did not wear the uniform of the empire. He bore the mission of a nation. On May 19, 1919, Kemal arrived in Samsun on the Black Sea, a starting point that seemed ordinary, but later would be seen as the birth of Turkey's spirit of resistance. Without an army, without a treasury, and without a flag to wave, there was only one thing: determination. He moved from village to village, convincing tribal leaders, citizens, intellectuals, and officers that Turkey was not the remnant of a dying empire. It had to be a new nation, with a soul, dignity, and sovereignty. From guerrilla resistance to armed organization, from the Erzurum Congress to the Sivas Congress, a national movement was born. And finally, in 1920, a new parliament was established in Ankara, a city deep inland, far from the influence of the Western powers. This was both a strategic choice and a symbol. Ankara was the undisturbed heart, the place where the flame of revolution was kindled. Here, Mustafa Kemal became the supreme leader of the national resistance. Not by title, but by the absolute trust of those who had bet their lives on the ideals of freedom. The following years were a relentless battle, not only against the invading Greek forces, but also against the internal divisions haunting the country. But gradually, lost territories were reclaimed. The national army was rebuilt, and the wind from Ankara began to blow back toward Istanbul. Mustafa Kemal was no longer just a general. He had become the symbol of resurrection, proof that from the ashes of an old empire, a new, strong, independent nation could sprout and rewrite its destiny with its own hands. The fight for independence, when a nation decides its own fate. By the mid-1920s, the confrontation between the Turkish resistance forces and the occupying powers entered its most brutal phase. Greece, backed by Britain, continued its military campaign in Anatolia, pushing deeper into the interior with the ambition of establishing a Greater Greece. However, they had not anticipated one crucial fact. Their opponent was no longer a decaying empire, but a people awakening. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish army reorganized with strict discipline and resolute determination. Step by step, they pushed the Greek forces out of the occupied territories. The climax came with the Great Offensive, Büyük Taarruz, in August 1922, culminating in the decisive victory at Dumlupınar, where Mustafa Kemal personally commanded the battle. After their defeat, the Greek forces fled. Izmir, the symbol of the occupation, was liberated. A wave of resistance spread throughout the country. Those who had once doubted were now silent, and those who had opposed began to seek ways to submit. Finally, in October 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, replacing the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres. Turkey was recognized as a sovereign nation, with clearly defined borders, no longer divided or under the control of foreign powers. Then, on October 29, 1923, in Ankara, a city in the heart of the barren plains, which had once been just a small railway station, the Republic of Turkey was officially declared. Mustafa Kemal became the first president. A revolution in the heart of tradition. When Ataturk redrew the portrait of a nation. After victory, a new nation was born. But Mustafa Kemal Atatürk understood clearly, military success was just the beginning. For Turkey to survive and grow, it needed a total revolution. Not on the battlefield, but in every corner of society. He began the Grand Reform with a series of bold, sometimes controversial changes. The monarchy was abolished, forever ending centuries of the Ottoman dynasty. Then, in 1924, he dissolved the caliphate, the highest symbol of the Sunni Muslim world. This decision shocked the Islamic world. But for Ataturk, a modern nation could not be subject to any religious authority. Language, clothing, and even the way time was counted were changed. The Arabic script was replaced by the Latin alphabet, improving literacy among the population. The fez, a traditional symbol, was banned and replaced with a Western-style hat. He passed a law requiring citizens to have surnames, and he himself adopted the name Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks. Women, who were once bound by Islamic customs, were now granted the right to study, work, divorce, and vote. While Europe was still debating women's rights, Turkey under Ataturk took the first steps toward gender equality. All these changes were not easy. Many rural areas resisted fiercely. Some clerics declared him a heretic. There were assassination attempts, uprisings, and even riots. But Ataturk did not retreat. He believed that if one did not dare to break the old, the new could never be built. And he succeeded, not because he forced people to believe in his ideals, but because he dared to dedicate his whole life to living by them. Building knowledge when schools replaced the mosque. For Ataturk, a modern nation could not stand firm if its people were still trapped in ignorance and superstition. From the very beginning, he established that education would be the most solid foundation for the renaissance of the nation. Under the Ottoman Empire, the education system was fragmented. A portion was under the control of Islamic clerics, while the rest was outdated and disjointed. Ataturk immediately nationalized education, removing religious influence from schools, and established a secular education system where knowledge and reason were the guiding principles. A network of public schools was expanded across the country, especially in rural areas. He established village schools, Koi Institutulari, where students not only learned to read and write, but were also trained in practical skills like farming, construction, and teaching. These educational models embodied the spirit of self-reliance that he championed. In 1928, Ataturk replaced the Arabic script with a modified Latin alphabet for the Turkish language, and he personally traveled across the country to hold literacy classes, even teaching lessons himself. Within a few years, literacy rates skyrocketed, a leap that had never been seen before in modern Turkish history. Rebuilding the economic foundations from the ashes of the empire. Under the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's economy was heavily reliant on foreign powers and non-Turkish financiers. When Ataturk came to power, he recognized that political independence would be meaningless if the nation did not have economic autonomy. He implemented a series of reforms to build a national economy based on industrialization and self-reliance. Key sectors such as steel, textiles, cement, and energy were heavily invested in by the state. Ataturk established state-owned banks, a national railway system, and national factories. From nothing, he laid the groundwork for a modernized Turkey. Agriculture, which was the cornerstone of the people's livelihood, was also reformed. He encouraged mechanization, land reforms, and the establishment of cooperatives and agricultural research institutes. No longer was farming fragmented and backward. Turkish farmers began to adopt new scientific and technological approaches to agriculture. Although Ataturk pursued a state-led economic model, he still encouraged private enterprise, particularly in trade, services, and small-scale industries. He understood that only an economy that combines state leadership with the creativity of the private sector could help Turkey break free from dependency and underdevelopment. The final years, when the flame slowly dims. As the first statues of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk began to rise in the squares of cities, he had not yet reached the age of 50. But behind the image of the unyielding reformer, shadows had started to creep in. In the 1930s, while the world plunged into economic crisis and fascism began to rise in Europe, Ataturk continued to lead Turkey on the path of modernization. He still spoke forcefully, still visited rural areas to inspect progress, and still emphasized the importance of science, industry, and national awakening. However, his body, after years of fighting, smoking, drinking, and living under constant pressure, began to rebel. His liver weakened. The disease of cirrhosis progressed slowly but relentlessly. The pain intensified, his voice grew hoarse, and public appearances became less frequent. Nevertheless, he did not step back. In his heart, Ataturk understood that his time was running out, and there was still much to be done before the light faded. In 1934, he officially adopted the title Ataturk, Father of the Turks, a name no one else could bear, symbolizing not only his contributions but also marking the formation of the national identity. That same year, he passed a law granting women the right to vote and run for office, a bold step that made Turkey one of the first countries in the Muslim world to grant political rights to women. In the final months of his life, Ataturk mostly resided in Dolmabahce Palace, the building by the Bosphorus that had once belonged to the Ottoman sultans he had replaced. Yet the room he occupied was simple, dimly lit, and often empty. His body grew frail, but his eyes retained the familiar calm and stubbornness. On November 10, 1938, at 9:05 a.m., Ataturk's heart stopped beating. The entire nation stood still. The church bells, the calls to prayer from mosques, and the train whistles from the harbors all blended together like an endless requiem. Legacy: the unfading shadow in Turkey's history. Ataturk left no direct heir, no bloodline to carry on his name. Yet the legacy he left, a nation, an identity, an ideal, continues to resonate powerfully through generations. After his death, millions poured into the streets, standing still in moments of remembrance. His body was laid to rest in Dolmabahce Palace and later transferred to Ankara, the capital he founded, where he was interred at Anıtkabir, the solemn mausoleum dedicated to one individual, the father of the nation. But Ataturk does not live only in marble or in the pages of history. He lives in the Latin alphabet the Turks use daily, replacing the old Arabic script. He lives in the freedoms granted to women, in the technical universities, and in the national founding speeches that students memorize. He lives in the idea that a Muslim nation can be modern, secular, and independent without losing its soul. His philosophy, known as Kemalism, remains a cornerstone of the Turkish Republic. It encompasses principles: nationalism, secularism, republicanism, revolution, equality, and economic nationalism. These principles were once a guiding light, and to this day they are still a topic of debate in politics and society. Though Turkey has gone through many upheavals, coups, instability, and shifts in direction, the name Ataturk is still mentioned with almost universal respect. His image hangs in classrooms, government offices, and even street-side cafes. The lira notes bear his likeness. And on the anniversary of his death, November 10, the entire nation pauses to bow its head. In a world where leaders are often forgotten or become symbols of division, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is a rare exception. A flesh-and-blood man who transcended legend. He did not just change history, he etched his name into the consciousness of a nation. In Ankara, the capital he chose as the new center, the Anıt Kabir mausoleum stands tall, not just as a memorial, but as a reminder. Humans may die, but great dreams never fade. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, a young officer who witnessed the fall of the Ottoman Empire, refused to become a mere survivor of the past. He transformed himself into the creator of a new future. Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.